All right. Now that everybody's muted, the board is back together for this evening to discuss a few items tonight, and I'll explain a little bit more later on what we'll be looking at. So I want to thank everyone again. I know it's been a busy week for everyone with schools starting across the state, classroom activities back in session, and people, working, being back from summer vacations, and realities back in full swing. So thank you with your patience and tolerance with everybody as we get this work continuing on its path. Now, we have 7:03 as our official commencement of tonight's board meeting. Now, the reason for tonight's meeting is going to be discussing some departmental proposals from ODHH in regards to the Maryland Licensure Act. There were several changes that were required. The board have already discussed them previously, and there are some items that ODHH has recommended based on feedback from people throughout the community. So we'll go over that tonight, and the board will review some of those proposed changes, provide feedback, support, etc., to anything that may be recommended. After that, we will then focus on clarifying some of the language that we are looking at in regards to educational interpreters and provisional licensure. Are there any questions? All right, seeing none, I do need somebody to propose the approval of the agenda.
This is Leslie. I move to approve the agenda as written. Second by Sue.
All in favor? All right, passes with unanimous consent. All right, moving on, we can start to discuss those departmental proposed changes. Now, GODHH has met with different stakeholders, PCRID, and several members of the community for feedback and thoughts around proposal or potential changes for the Act. And we're looking at having these submitted for the 2026 legislative session. Now, first, the past meeting, we discussed something rather repeatedly in regards to certification. And within the law, there is one change that for general licensure, it says you must be certified. You must have certification, and that is the primary concern of the boards. There is no consideration for alternate pathways or anything along those lines. And we as the board have committed to changing that language as a technical change to the Act, and to allow other criteria as designated by the board. Again, these alternate pathways for licensure or recognize alternate pathways for certification. So this is something that we have discussed in the past and the board has approved. So we are again recommitting to supporting that change because that is something the community wants to see. And we are hoping to see that happen in the 2026 legislative session.
Yeah, so the exact language will be shared in the proposal.
One moment, please. ODHH, if you wouldn't mind sharing the screen for, oh, perfect. This is the technical change language as proposed. All right, seeing everybody has read this. That is what has been proposed in the past. Is there any more discussion that the board needs to have on that section?
Not at this time.
And does the board still support that?
Yes, we're still in favor of that change.
All right. Seeing that the board is in favor, we can move along to the next section, which is in regards to the complement of the board. Now, currently the board is a board of 7. We have the MDAD representative, the PCRID representative, and the deafblind representative. Then 4 additional community members as the full complement. Now, ODHH has had conversations with PCRID, and they have actually proposed removing the PCRID membership and that seat specifically designated to them, to be one interpreter with licensure. Ashla, am I correct? Is that the correct recommendation?
That's correct, Chair.
Thank you. So that allows a little bit of flexibility with non-PCRID members or other organizations out there are able to have a representative seat of a licensed interpreter on the board. What are the thoughts of the board? Leslie?
So this is Leslie speaking. So really, I'm not in support of that removal of that designated seat. Okay. We already meet the general community member seats, and I think it is mission critical for our local RID affiliate chapter and body to provide representation, designated representation. I know that has been a struggle as of late, but if PCRID continues to be active, technically they are, for example, required to host an annual meeting, and at that annual meeting, they could become more involved with the state board in terms of voting during that meeting, during that 2-year period. Because after the initial board, each time moving forward, it will be biannual, which means PCRD already has had those 2 years, means they would then vote to pick another member, and that member could be appointed. So not by just the PCRD board, but by a membership vote. So we could change it. The problem with Niobe is that it's a DC chapter, not a Maryland chapter specifically. Okay, that doesn't mean there aren't Maryland interpreters involved, but we have to represent Maryland, and PCRD does represent Maryland, DC, and Northern Virginia. And I know we're talking about residents of Maryland, but I think it's important to have representation designated to focus and support PCRID related issues. I mean, we say, for example, we could just have a deaf representative, but the intention of having an MDAD representative is very specific. The same is true with a PCRID representative. It's not just a general licensed interpreter, it's representing that particular organization. So I feel strongly that we should maintain that designated seat for PCRID.
Yes, this is Chair Leffler, and I would like to provide some insights based on some conversations that I've had with Director DeBerry and PCRID. And this is something that the PCRID board themselves recommend for the removal of that specific language of a designated seat for them. And I've had some conversations with MDAD, and it seems they do not want to remove their designated positions on the board. They want to maintain that representation going forward as well.
I think it's also important to recognize as well the president of PCRID right now is interim. Okay, that was not an elected position. And the board has never contacted the membership about their feelings about that. So I feel a conversation with PCRID and its board right now, yes, it's good, but how many people were actually there? 4 out of how many total members? And the PCRID president, again, is not currently an appointed position. It is an interim replacement. So I think before we remove PCRID as a designated seat, I think they need to reach out to their membership and curate the thoughts and feelings of their membership on that issue.
Yes, Member Beaver, do you have any thoughts on this matter?
So honestly, I agree. I feel as though the members should be asked about their feelings of removing that designated seat. I think right now, the fact that there's an interim, not an elected president, is another valid point.
Okay, so it seems like the board actually does not want to remove PCRID from the legal obligation or of the board to have a representative member. So the board does not seem to be in favor of that concept at this time. Director DeBerry, would you like to add anything or provide comments?
My apologies. I couldn't get my camera to turn on. My apologies. Hello, good evening, board. In addition to that, based on my conversations with the Potomac chapter of the Registry of Interpreters for the Deaf, their members are not all Maryland residents.
Mhm.
That was something I gleaned from our conversation. In addition to that, when it comes to asking their members to sit on their board, they didn't feel that was appropriate due to the 501c3 status of the organization. That seat, that designated seat, should have quote unquote never happened due to their 501c3 status. They also felt that it was not appropriate to reach out because they really haven't had anyone to fill that seat since Kaylee vacated it. And there's been some challenges. So now, I'm not sure with the appointment office if that would go through, but with all the criteria necessary, the background check, so forth and so on, that might not happen. But the 501c3 status and the fact that not all of their membership reside in the state of Maryland were their two biggest points as to why they don't feel there should be a seat.
So I do have a question as Vice Chair. The 501c3, are they 501c3 incorporated in Maryland?
Is MDAD
Be
also a 501c3?
oh, because if that is the case, then that similar argument would then apply to the Maryland Association of the Deaf. Now, we did have a PCRID member on the board that resigned after I joined, and also they were already aware that the name was for the next representative was in the application process. ODHH had sent that into the office. So we already have a person in the pipeline, designated and appointed, who is deaf, POC, and a representative. The name is there and ready to, but unfortunately, we're removed from consideration. I guess if PCRID is a 501c3, then that means that they would not be able to have a representative legally mandated, which would then put MDAD in the same position. So we need to essentially wait for the appointments office approval on the next representative. And this is Chair Leffler. Do you mind clarifying what you mean about the 501c3 status, whether that's they're able to maintain good standing, or if PCRD feels that their 501c3 status, because of that standing, means that they are not able to maintain a position on the board?
Certainly. The 501c3 status, uh-oh,
Director DeBerry, you frozen?
can you see me now? Okay. Let me restate that. The 501c3 status leads them to feel that it's not appropriate to have a designated seat on the board. Okay. I don't have any names. We're waiting on the appointment office for that. I'm not holding any names currently.
Okay, so my understanding is that PCRID already has submitted names for representatives,
That
correct?
is correct. Yes.
So help me to understand a little bit more how the 501c3 status has an impact from an organizational standpoint when it comes to different memberships on the board. Is there a specific issue that causes a conflict or et cetera? Do you mean, or are you trying to say that if we remove PCRID, then we have more flexibility?
Can I
Please.
respond, Chair? So essentially, yes, they would like to see more flexibility because, again, not all of their members are residents of the state of Maryland. Currently, the way the law is written, it says in statute that everyone has to be a resident of Maryland. So not having a designated seat for PCRID provides more flexibility for individuals who might be working experienced interpreters, but not might necessarily be members of PCRID.
Thank you. So, board, what would we like to do with PCRID as codified in law?
I think it's important, again, for PCRID's membership to have that on the record in terms of documentation of how many both deaf and hearing interpreters they have as their membership that live in the state of Maryland.
So it seems like the board is not in favor of removing PCRID from statute right now.
This is Leslie. I am not in favor of removing that designated seat.
Sue?
This is Sue. I understand PCRID's perspective about broadening the potential pool for other interpreters to serve on the board. And to me, it sounds like that the biggest conflict, for lack of a better word, is that they have members that both reside in the state of Maryland and in the District of Columbia, as well as Virginia, if I'm remembering that correctly. That said, if they are requesting as an organization to have their seat removed, if we don't move forward and remove it, would they still be willing to submit names to the appointment office to fill that seat? And would they really work in support of the board, and would we ultimately be productive?
This is Vice Chair Puzio. Jacob, you might know, does MDAD allow members who are not living within Maryland to become members of their organization?
They do.
So what's the difference between the two organizations? So if MD80 only permitted members to become members who are residents of Maryland, then I would understand it. I think that would justify PCRID's position. But if anyone, not necessarily a Maryland resident, can become a member of MDAD, then PCRID is essentially in the same position. So it would have that same caveat when it comes to their membership.
So to clarify, the Maryland Association of Deaf allows anybody to become a member, but in order to serve on the board as an officer, you have to be a resident of the state of Maryland. So just that clarification.
Okay. So it seems like the board does not want to change the language as written. Ms. Chair Leffler, thank you. We can move forward. Now, when it comes to the number of the board, we currently are a board of 7. Right now, it doesn't matter whether those individuals are hearing or deaf. ODHH has proposed a 51% majority deaf membership of the board. And they're asking to add language be codified into law that the board shall be 51% majority of deaf or hard of hearing, deaf-blind individuals. What are the board's thoughts on this proposed change?
May I? I was trying to wait to see if Sue would jump in first. This is Leslie speaking. So my thoughts on this is that I support it. We might have to have a more in-depth discussion of what that will ultimately look like in real time. For example, does a specific organizational member, PCRID, for example, that member, do they have to be deaf? Because they could be deaf or hearing. Now, for the deaf blind representative, that's a little bit more concrete. But we have people, I don't know, we're opening up to people who we want to be flexible, but I think that could be a struggle. I'm in full support of the 51% deaf majority. And I think it behooves us to be strategic about who is in these positions. For example, the 4 community member positions, for those, maybe we say 2 community members must be deaf and then 2 community members must be hearing, meaning that deaf blind would automatically, with deafblind, that would automatically make 3. And then the MDAD appointee would be deaf, that makes 4, as opposed to saying community members and then keeping it broad, those 4 remaining seats. If we keep that open, in that case, we could have some issues and there could be an imbalance, 6 deaf and 1 hearing. I don't necessarily think that's wrong, but I think it's important that when we name specific positions or representation, we want to do it in a way that gives us the most diversity in terms of perspectives on the field of interpreting.
And this is, Member Beaver, I do support the 51% majority deaf, but I do think we're at the point where we need to be maybe specific about the community members' positions. I think it's a good idea if we were to have 2 of those who are deaf and 2 of those who are hearing individuals from the communities. And we can make sure that the 51% is satisfied by deaf board members. Because again, The board has changed and will continue to change with 2-year biannual terms. So again, so we have that criteria already codified in law. As Chair
Great. Go
Leffler,
ahead. Go ahead.
I support the 51% as proposed by the Office of the Deaf and Hard of Hearing of Maryland and looking at those 4 community members and stipulating specifics there. For the deaf community members who have experience working with interpreters is another position, deaf blind interpreters, agency representatives. Yes, Member Beaver.
Yes, by all means, Sue. Okay, so I'll start us off for this conversation. I do have some concerns because it says experience with interpreters or interpreting. I'd like some clarification there. So I'm assuming that doesn't mean national certification because remember, the law says that all board members, a certification. No, it doesn't. No
Mm-mm.
certification is required for board members. Okay, I withdraw that. Thank you for the clarification. That said, specifically for the agency representative, I'd like to know a little bit more about what that looks like. Okay, would that mean, for example, the CFO or a coordinator who is not boots on the ground as an interpreter and has no experience in the field, you know, and is just maybe hired for the purposes of scheduling if that's the person picked? So I think we need to be a little bit more specific if we decide that we want to move forward with an agency representative. I think we need to be very specific in terms of what their role within the agency would be to be able to be qualified to be part of the board. So it says here, and professional experience with interpreters and interpreting. Again, I would like some clarification on that language as well. Define that for me, please. That can be interpreted very broadly, that particular statement.
So another consideration that we might want to discuss, if we provide specific names, so we could say 2 deaf community members, they could be interpreters and they could be deaf and experienced in working with interpreters. So we could do that. And then 2 hearing interpreters, or 2 hearing, nope, sorry, let me rephrase that. 2 hearing interpreters or whatever. And those could also be a representative. I mean, so in the representative or an agency could be also deaf as well. So we have several different agency owners who are themselves deaf. So we have deaf-owned agencies and we have hearing-owned agencies. So we could also stipulate that as a specific requirement. And if we're looking for broad and flexible language, I think that would provide some uh, benefit in the fact that we have had difficulties getting board members in the past. And again, 51% deaf majority, we support that. We have 3 members and of one contingent and 4 members of another, or we could play with the numbers. Vice Chair Puccio.
This is Leslie speaking. So I'm sure there's many people watching the meeting now. In addition, Jacob, we know that we were part of the writing of the bill. And I want to say in the past, we originally had a complement of 12 seats in the original language of the
Mhm.
original bill, and that was scaled down to 7. And all the specified designated seats were removed because we recognized it was going to be very difficult. I think in the past, we had a representative from an interpreting program. Well, as we know, there are only 2 in the state of Maryland, so that would have been difficult. In addition, if we think about agencies, maybe an agency is established and is headquartered in DC but serves the state of Maryland, that then becomes an issue. Or an individual who is working for an agency in Maryland and serves Maryland, but that person themselves resides in a different state. So I think at the current moment, in my opinion, because we have struggled with fully having a full complement of the board, we haven't had one in quite some time. I don't think ever. So I think we should start with the up to 6, but we've never had a full complement. So we've already struggled to fill the number of seats that we have. Now, I agree, maybe designating those 4 community seats to make sure we maintain that 51% majority is warranted, but nothing beyond that.
This is Chair Lebser. I would like to ask Director DeBerry to please come on screen for some discussion. Director DeBerry?
Can you see me?
Yeah. Yes, we can. Okay. Director DeBerry, did you see what the board was recently discussing?
I did.
Thank you. How do you feel about us moving forward with the four community member positions, those seats being designated as two deaf community members and two hearing community members? The board doesn't want to have necessarily a specific agency representation, deaf interpreters, deaf blind interpreters, et cetera. We feel like we have struggled with our vacancies up to this point. So having it broadly representative by having two deaf community members and two hearing community members would provide some level of diversity of views and provide the ability to have deaf blind representation with the current seat as well.
Can I ask a question? Are we still going to move forward with removing the PCRID designated seat?
Is Vice Chair Puzio, we're keeping that.
Okay, then I think we're still going to have a challenge.
Why?
Reason being, I have a statement from PCRID, if I may, bear with me. Okay, this is pretty long. I will try to summarize the statement from the organization. 501c3 status for Professional Association PCRID's mission is to advance the sign language interpreting profession and to support our members through professional development, networking opportunities, and advocacy. The members are not only individual interpreters and agencies, but also deaf, blind, and hard of hearing stakeholders, as well as community members. The results from a legal perspective is that the members comprise both competitors and non-members. Therefore, PCRID is subject to federal and, I'm sorry, consumers and state regulatory laws, price fixing, bidding, rigidity, and marketing allocation. There are concerns that providing interpreting services directly to ODHH, a government entity, can actively violate the core principles and legal framework. They acknowledge the challenge in finding interpreters as well. So that is a little bit of an explanation about the 501c3 status. Now, I agree and I support the concept of designating within those four community members, allocating two for hearing and two for deaf. That being said, I think the flexibility based on PCRID's concerns about removing that designated seat would be something the board should entertain for now.
So it seems that we are all agreeing on these changes as proposed, with the exception of the PCRID specifics. Now, Vice Chair Puzio or Member Beaver, maybe we should have a meeting with PCRD and MDAD, just a follow on.
Thank you.
Director DeBerry, Director DeBerry, could you come back on screen, please? Did you see my question to the board?
My apologies. I'm here. Go ahead. I can certainly call a meeting to that effect, no problem. My report is actually due this Friday,
Okay.
so I can submit it and then we can revisit it.
So, board, would we like to try to meet with the PCRD membership tomorrow
MDAD.
or Friday to figure out if we can come to consensus on this?
I can certainly work on scheduling a meeting.
All right, thank you. And then there's one more change that ODHH has proposed is that the board now looking at the law is that the individuals must be residents of Maryland. Now, PCRID, are they proposing to remove that specific line requirement, restricted Barry?
Yes.
Okay, so removing that requirement from the law so that other interpreters outside of the residents of the state of Maryland could also serve on the board.
So I believe the language was something to the effect of region, region meaning including District of Columbia. So we already work very closely with the District of Columbia, so creating it more as a region versus a state. PCRID has a great relationship with NAOBDC as well, and we would like to expand it to represent regionally, so that would include possibly Virginia as well. So the DMV area is what they're looking towards.
So this is Vice Chair Puzzi. I'm not in favor or support that. So for Maryland, Virginia, and DC, are you opening this up to West Virginia, Pennsylvania, Delaware, any interpreters that work within the state? So is that what is intended by region? Are we considering opening up to the broader region?
That's not what was discussed. If that's the pleasure of the board to discuss that at this point, you certainly can. If you do that, then maybe we remove the line where it says Maryland and open it up to other states. There are other states out there who follow that as an example. They have residents outside their state on the board. I do think we should give Maryland priority and seniority on the board. And then if we need support from neighboring states, that's something that we could look into if we needed it just to keep seats on the board filled.
Ms. Chair Leffler, thank you for that explanation. Member Beaver, do you have any thoughts on this regard?
This is Sue speaking now. I do have some thoughts. So I'm concerned about credibility specifically and reliability and trust, to be completely honest, from the community when it comes to these changes. Because if we start pulling in representatives from other states, they are now making decisions about interpreters who work within the state of Maryland when they're a resident of a completely different state and they might not need to adhere to these regs at all, depending on their work situation. In addition to that, they might not necessarily know the state of Maryland and the nuances and needs of the region of Maryland and the interpreters who reside and work therein. I just, no, I'm not in favor of removing the residency requirement just because that's how I feel.
Ms. Chair Leffler, thank you. Now, Vice Chair Puzio.
Actually, I'm just going to echo a lot of what Sue said. I feel the same way. I think the only way to close the gap is if we require any out of state board member to have to be a licensed interpreter within the state of Maryland. And I'm not going to say most of their work, that would be hard to quantify, but meaning we can't have a community member, we can't have a deaf person, who doesn't do that. So then it would fall on the hearing deaf interpreter to be licensed in the state of Maryland. We are a state board. Our focus is on the state of Maryland and operations therein. And I understand that there are interpreters that do not reside in the state of Maryland, many of them. I fully understand that. However, we're a state board. It is what it is. I think it is important for us to maintain the intention and the spirit in which the law was written. It was written with a lot of government and state advice and Senate advice. And I don't know if all state boards, but I know a lot of state boards in the state of Maryland, when we did our due diligence, most, if not all, require their members, those serving on the board, to be residents of the state of Maryland. So I think it's important to adhere to a standard already set by other boards here in the state.
Thank you for the discussion. So it seems like we want to keep the language as written, requiring residency of Maryland as a key component of eligibility for the board. Thank you. So now we will need to then have the next steps of reaching out to PCRD, a meeting with some of their membership, and then also looking at potentially other organizational nominees for the board. So it seems like we're on the same page. Director DeBerry, want to make
I'm just going to go ahead. I can't see you, but yes, I was following along and I will. Thank you.
that's the first part of our agenda for this evening. We'll move on to the second part about clarifying language in regards to educational interpreting. My understanding is that we've had a rather long discussion on this when it comes to educational interpreting, where interpreters work, where they can and cannot work, so on and so forth. We have gotten feedback from our legal advisor, the Assistant Attorney General, and asking us to clarify on what specifically we want to do with educational interpreting. I think it is important for us to revisit that part of our discussions to figure out specifically what we want for educational interpreting, the work environment, and what we want to see there. Now, my understanding from our previous board meetings and some of the discussions that we've had, and I'll try to recap here, is general licensed interpreters can work within any setting. Educational interpreters are only the required, or rather, are required to have an EIPA 3.7 or above and to pass the EIPA written exam in order to work within solely the educational setting. Now, for general provisional licensed interpreters, there has been some conversation regarding that and whether the provisional license can or cannot work within educational settings. And we landed on cannot, correct? That's what we've been discussing over the past few months. So, Vice Chair Puzio or Member Beaver, is there anything that you'd like to add to that statement?
I'll let Sue share her thoughts first.
Sure.
Thank you. I
Member,
appreciate that. So since the last meeting when we did have that conversation about the CASLI written test, I've been thinking a lot about this particular issue. And at this point, I feel that we should accept the CASLI provisional, CASLI provisional, written test, excuse me, the written test, and accept that for provisional licensure to be able to work in a K-12 setting. And I have several reasons that I've outlined for this, so please bear with me as I reference my notes. Okay, so I'm going to use my area as an example. 1 second, Usher.
sorry, Director DeBerry, please could you turn off your video? Member Beaver, if you are comfortable with, please proceed.
Certainly I can. So for example, in the Eastern Shore of Maryland, I looked at the Registry of Interpreters for the Deaf and their directory, all 51 pages, and I was searching to find out how many certified interpreters there resided on the Eastern Shore. Talbot County, Dorchester County, and Wacomico counties specifically. In addition to that, Somerset and Worcestershire. And from what I can find, we have a current complement of 6 certified interpreters. Okay. One of them is freelance. 5 of them work specifically in areas. Okay. And none are in the school system. So that means that the majority of our interpreters working in those school systems of those aforementioned counties are not certified. Now, for Wacomico County specifically, there are about 4 to 5 deaf students, based on my understanding. And I do not know their ADA status. I'm sure most of them have not taken but I cannot confirm whether or not they've taken the EIPA because, of course, it's confidential. I do not know their scores. I do not know if they've passed or failed. Okay. But that does not leave a lot of interpreters working in the school systems. So I think at this point, we should accept the CASLI written test for working in educational settings, specifically for that reason. Because if we were to require provisional licensure of a 3.7 for the EIPA, as well as the written test having been passed, that's going to exclude a lot of interpreters who might have passed, who might have passed the provisional written test for CASLI and not yet have taken the performance. But that would give them the opportunity to still work in those settings, particularly when it comes to substitute interpreter needs. For example, in my county, was the only interpreter working, and if I fall ill, they have to look and try to find somebody to sub me out. And there were many days that my student had no interpreter all day. And then the next day, when I arrived back to work in the school, my student would be understandably upset for obvious reasons. I would be upset if I was in that position. And they would tell me I missed a whole day's worth of education. So, what happens to those students in rural areas? The Eastern Shore is still part of Maryland. We are here, although overlooked. Southern Maryland, Western Maryland are also here and parts of the state of Maryland. Maryland is not just comprised of Baltimore. So I think we need to broaden things and allow interpreters to work in the educational system in that K-12 setting. Another point is if they have passed the CASLI written, you have up to 5 years to take the performance test. And if not, then you have to start all over again with the written. So passing that written test encourages interpreters to improve their skills, to take professional development, and to work towards ultimately passing the performance. The EIPA also has a written test that we can pass, and then, of course, that 3.7 for the performance. However, if that is where we set our standard, where is the incentive to continue to develop and continue to hone one's skills? Also, a provisional license. I believe the intent and the spirit of the provisional license is to incentivize and to continue to learn and grow and develop. When you think about other fields, other businesses, other industries, that is the way they set things up when it comes to therapists who get clinical hours, those types of things. That is a time for learning and developing your craft. And I'm concerned that if we don't accept the CASLI written exam, what is going to happen to deaf interpreters working in the school system? The CASLI written exam is accessible for deaf interpreters. The EIPA is not. And we've had a lot of conversation, okay, about role models, deaf role models, and how mission critical that is for deaf and hard of hearing students. And if we don't accept the CASLI written as a provisional, then how can deaf interpreters get a foot in the door in the school systems and serve as those role models for those deaf and hard of hearing students and provide that service? So again, like I said, I've had a lot of time to ruminate on this since the last meeting, and these are my thoughts. And I really have changed my mind about this particular issue. So I would love to hear feedback from the other members of the board.
This is Chair Leffler. Thank you, Sue, for your perspectives and opinions, and also all of your considerations that you've provided us with those comments. I think it is absolutely invaluable. I think we should really have a very diverse understanding and perspective when it comes to this community and not just the board. We want this to be a community process, meaning that it's owned and incorporating the community's feedback, positions, and understandings. So, Vice Chair Puzio, do you have any comments that you'd like to add?
I do several things. I am in favor of provisionals not being allowed to work in education. You know, removing the 3.7, I think again, mm, no, the ethical piece of the CASLI, that information doesn't help an interpreter in an educational setting, which is the predominant piece of the written. I also think we do need to recognize that the four of us voted and passed, and this discussion right now is how to clarify the language, not to amend or change our vote, in my opinion. But if we want to reopen the discussion in terms of allowing it and what it should look like, I still personally do not think it's appropriate for an interpreter who has only passed a knowledge and ethical exam about the field of interpreting with and who potentially could have no production and no practical skills to be serving as a role model or working in a school setting. I mean, technically, we could have students who have taken nothing beyond ASL 1 or 2 study, pass the CASLI written exam, and then have a very, very novice signer in a classroom. I fully understand the challenges that rural areas face. I'm not myself in a rural area, but I did interpret on the Eastern Shore for several years when I lived there. So I have some knowledge and familiarity about services, interpreting services specifically again there. And again, the lack of education or certified interpreters in that setting. I mean, the statistics about how many folks with an EIPA on the Eastern Shore and in Southern Maryland or in Western Maryland, those rural areas and other counties in Maryland, we don't have a lot of 3.7 or high scores. But our decision as a board is not about how many interpreters are available. It's about access and the quality of the services for the students. So it goes back to what is our mission and our goal as a board to ensure that there's enough interpreters available, or is it to ensure that we are not allowing unqualified interpreters to interpret for our deaf community? And I still am in favor of not allowing provisional holders to work in the field of education. And again, you can have a provisional for up to 5 years, and both require continued education. And we did add CEUs for our provisional education to force them to develop and hone their skills and craft.
Yes. Do you mind clarifying when you're talking about the CASLI written? I know it's knowledge and ethics as an exam, but you said they may be rudimentary at best and they can pass that. So my understanding when it comes to production or practical skills. So there's no, I mean, there's a performance aspect of the CASLI test that requires receptive ability. Yes?
Yes, but if there's a question that is signed, you also have access to it in printed English. So for a deaf person who might not have, proficient skills, they might be at a loss. They might not understand the written question, but they would understand it in ASL. Okay. The question is exactly the same. Many of the questions are exactly the same, both in ASL and in print. There's no performance metric for that test. There is a receptive requirement for few of the questions, but there is no performance metric from the person who is taking the test. They do not have to lift their hands at all. They do not have to demonstrate the internal mental interpreting processes. Watching and understanding sign language receptively is very different than the act of interpreting. You can understand somebody who's signing. Okay, could somebody turn off the comments, please? Okay, this is not an open discussion. So, as I was saying, a deaf person taking the test, okay, doesn't necessarily translate to that person having in interpreting skills, which is same as a hearing person taking the test. That doesn't necessarily translate to interpreting skills. Okay. Now, if you're basing it on their receptive skills, meaning that you can go into any area with insufficient signing skills and interpret, I just disagree with that as a philosophy, but that is just my opinion.
Okay. And I think what Sue's pointing out for us was when it comes to deaf interpreters, right? The EIPA test itself is not accessible for deaf interpreters. It's not accessible for deaf people at all. So if there are some deaf interpreters that want to work in the school systems, how do we find a way to permit them into those spaces?
They get a CDI.
But that requires the taking of a written test and performance test by CASLI. That's a two-step process. So what if they want to work right now? We don't have a way to allow them to work within the educational system if we're not allowing them to simply pass a written test and then have those practicum years.
But next legislative session, when we make changes to the educational requirement, okay, we cannot create an educational specialization right now.
I understand that.
Meaning, really, from a technical perspective, next year we will have that specialization, meaning those interpreters have to be nationally or regionally certified and or have a 3.7 or a 4.0 or whatever.
And don't forget the alternative pathways as well,
Well, right,
or alternative
those
criteria.
criteria. Yeah, if the focus is education. Meaning those alternative pathways if a deaf person wants to work in a school system. Also, how many deaf interpreters are actually working currently in the school systems? It doesn't matter, this is Sue, how many are currently working within the school systems at this moment. If they want the opportunity to do so, they should have the opportunity to do so. We cannot exclude them arbitrarily from working in the school system just because we won't accept the CASLI written exam if they've passed it. I mean, that's not fair. In addition to that, deaf interpreters in the school system are, bar none, the best role models for our deaf and hard of hearing children. Okay, hearing interpreters are not. Well, then I think it would be fair if we, then at that, this is Leslie, I think it would be fair if we decide to go ahead and accept the CASLI, then we should remove the 3.7 requirement for the EIPA, and accept the EIPA written only. Okay, this is Sue. I think we should still keep the 3.7 because the EIPA written exam does not require taking the performance at all. Okay. You can take the written exam and it does not start a time clock for taking the performance. So then you could work. And that motivation to develop one's skills or to do the minimum requirement or get the minimum amount of CEUs doesn't exist. If you take the CASLI written, that clock then starts and it requires professional development and continued learning in order to ultimately pass the performance test, right? And that would allow the interpreting pool for K-12 to grow. And those interpreters would be able to work also in community settings. And that would ultimately improve their skills as well. So it would help both the community side of things as well as the K-12 side of things by expanding that pool of interpreters, in my opinion. So this is Leslie. For the provisional educational, all of them are up to 5 years, either one. So if an interpreter takes the written EIPA, they only have up to 5 years as well. So there's still a clock. Okay, the same is true for CASLI, the ethical exam. You have up to 5 years to take the performance. You have 5 years and then you can't reapply for the provisional. I'm talking about our regs. I'm not talking about the tests respectively. I'm talking about with our regs, there is language built in to start a 5-year time clock. So true, while the EIPA doesn't require you to take the performance, but you can't reapply for a provisional after 5 years. So both are the same situations essentially and start that same time clock. I mean, maybe we could say only deaf interpreters could take the CASLI and all the hearing interpreters have to take the EIPA 3.7. And we won't accept written CASLI from hearing interpreters because they have access to the other test, while the deaf community, we would allow and accept the ethical piece for the CASLI. That's an option.
So I do have a question for you, Sue, if you don't mind. As an educational interpreter specialized in that, What is the ethical or what is the written test of EIPA? Is it grammar, ethics? What does comprise the content area that are tested by the written test of EIPA?
Well, you have to remember I took that test several years ago. But if you go to the website, I want to say there's 5 different domains that they test, and I would have to revisit it and look. But it is not completely ethics focused.
Okay. So for the EIPA's test, do they test based on productive skills? Their performance there doesn't require, I mean, it would require productive skills as well as receptive skills, but not necessarily ethics, etc. So with that in mind, the CASLI written test and their productive receptive or and the receptive skills required for that. My understanding from discussing it with several people is that for the education, uh, essentially to pass that test is, or sorry, rather to pass the educational test through APA is easy, whereas the knowledge requirement of interpreting profession under CASLI is more difficult.
Well, it's about the operations, but it does not test the interpreting process. It does not test how mentally, what takes place mentally, okay, and interpreting capabilities. That's not one of the metrics. It's multi-part.
Hmm. So, what do we want to do with educational interpreting, specifically the provisional license for educational interpreters?
We need a tiebreaker, I guess. That said, this is Leslie. Again, my original question, is it okay for us to re-vote without the fourth person who originally voted yes from an ethical perspective? So there were 4 votes originally in favor of requiring the written EIPA and not accepting the CASLI. And now we're going back without one of those individuals who voted originally yes. So from an ethical perspective, I don't know board operations if that is ethically permitted.
So, my understanding is that we are at quorum now.
Correct. My question, is it okay for us when we have already voted with a complement of 4? Okay, and everybody was unanimously in agreement that the CASLI ethical written test was not acceptable to qualify for a general provisional to work in education. We voted on that and everybody was in favor. Now the ask is maybe to re-vote, and is that allowable with the 3 of us?
I think we would want to go into closed session for about 5 minutes to discuss this. I need a motion for that.
Okay, I have a statement. This is Leslie. I move for the board to move into closed session for the purpose of getting advice on board procedures and operations on the language statute that we have with the language statute that's listed in our agenda. And I don't know the exact statutory code to move into closed session, but it is listed in our agenda.
All right, it's seconded by Member Beaver. So we, as a board, are agreeing to move into executive session. We'll move into another room with our AAG, the interpreters, and board members. We'll set up a separate breakout room, and we will ask the community to stay in the main room.
Okay, and if we could make sure that we turn off all of the comments, meaning that people aren't going to have the opportunity to chat using the chat box in Zoom. Someone did, so we just want to make sure that comments are off for the remainder of the meeting.
Yes, Tanea, could you also move the 3 board members into the room, a breakout room of some sort, with Ethan, our AAG, Sonnenstrahl, with everyone that is from the community waiting in this main room, please. So we're just going to wait a few moments for technical issues that we are having, and we will be proceeding shortly. Thank you for your patience, everyone, board included.
All right, we are officially returning at 8:21. We thank the community for their patience while we moved into closed session to seek legal counsel on some procedural matters.
All right, this is Jerry Leffler. Please don't make any comments in the chat. We are here as a board for allowing the community to observe our public discussion. However, the closed session is for us to seek legal advice from our counsel, and that is why we went into the closed session. The council, we are reading this chats, and they are inappropriate as made. So please, the chat will now be disabled and refrain from making any further comments. All right, back to the discussion as germane to tonight's topic. So we do have quorum, and we can continue with the discussion and a potential vote on what we would like to do in regards to provisional licensure. Vice Chair Puccio.
This is Leslie. Okay, getting back to what we were talking about earlier about the number of available interpreters, we recognize that that is a struggle and it is difficult nationwide to find interpreters currently. And we are well aware of the lack of interpreter availability. Interpreter availability does not equal quality, okay, and qualified interpreters as defined by statute. And the purpose of the law is to elevate the profession and encourage those within the profession to improve their skill set for the benefit of the community that uses interpreters so that they ultimately have equal access to the information. Now, that said, also we recognize the challenges therein. So I have a question. If we were to say, and I know the underlying issues between hearing and deaf and who can take which test and who has access to which test. But if I'm reading it correctly, deaf interpreters have the ability to take both the CASLI, written and performance, and then they can take the EIPA written. Okay. There's no deaf interpreting performance, but they do have the option of taking the EIPA written. So what if, because the written is about English fluency and educational related specific topics. So if we were to say the educational provisional, we keep that as is. And for the general provisional, we say if they have the CASLI and the EIPA of a 3.7, they can work in education as well as the general community, with the exception of medical and mental health with a licensed interpreter. And if they pass the written EIPA and the written CASLI, knowledge and ethical exam, then they can work in education and generally speaking. Am I making sense? Was that clear?
Yes, I think I understand, but it seems a bit complicated as well. For me, I want to keep it simple. I think already we don't want to introduce more complexities into what we're looking at. We want to look at what works for us for ODHH and eliminate as much confusion as possible. And I think we are looking for something that's simple.
But there's the concern about, is the concern about the language process or the quality of interpreters?
So I agree. We want the best quality service as possible. Absolutely. 100% agreement on that. I don't think anybody would disagree.
So I'm trying to find a happy medium. Okay. If we allow a person, for example, to take the CASLI for provisional or the EIPA written for that matter. Well, no, let me go back. If an interpreter takes the CASLI knowledge and ethical exam and passes, and then they work anywhere with the exception of a legal environment or setting, and medical and mental health, we've already stated they need to be working with a licensed interpreter. If they also take the EIPA and pass with the 3.7, then they could also work not only anywhere in the community, educational included, and then medical and mental health with a licensed interpreter. So for those interpreters who pass the CASLI, they could then work in education, meaning it still requires them to take the EIPA. Or maybe we revert back to working in education with a licensed interpreter. And then there's a level of oversight baked in for those who have taken the knowledge and ethical piece.
Member Beaver, do you have any comments or thoughts?
Give me a moment to collect my thoughts. I'm not as quick on my feet as Leslie. You know. I feel that that's a lot to ask of an interpreter to do, to take the CASLI plus the EIPA. My perspective is that the CASLI written test really encourages interpreters to ultimately become nationally certified. And most will continue in this profession. If it's the EIPA, only with the written, actually, let me take a step back. We were talking about if we were to accept the CASLI written test, then we should also accept the EIPA written test only for that provisional license requirement. So that was a comment you made before.
Right. And now we're looking at what could potentially be modified to look at the requirements for the ability to have the proof of skills within the area.
It was my understanding that the CASLI written did have a receptive component to it, understanding, not an expressive performance part. If an individual can receptively understand sign language, then I would think that that would translate them translate into them being able to produce ASL. However, if we accept the CASLI written, again, I think it opens the door and it encourages interpreters ultimately to hone their craft, to develop their skill. If we don't accept the CASLI written exam and only accept the EIPA minimum and the written, then those interpreters will work in the school system and then ultimately they will matriculate out of the school system. And that does not bolster the pool of community interpreters. I think the CASLI, if we do accept that, we're going to grow and enlarge our interpreting pool for the community. And we all, of course, want the best quality interpreters. That's what we're all working towards. But we also have to live in the real world. And how do I say, what is the impact on the children if at the beginning of the school year there are no interpreters? We have kids who are going to be languishing in rural classrooms in rural areas who will have no access, no instructional access at all. We have to start somewhere, is my point.
You are correct. And if you look at the history, it always starts somewhere where there has been no requirements. And if we say, well, what's to happen? You're like, so a counterexample, if we have a student, for example, where an interpreter passed the CASLI knowledge and ethics exam, and then they have their 5 years, and look at a student starting kindergarten, their full elementary experience. They may have an interpreter who cannot pass the performance exam, but did pass that knowledge and ethics exam. So if a student has an interpreter, that interpreter, and again, the ADA law is there, parents could then sue the school system, meaning the school system would then have to recruit someone. They have the liability. The school system has the liability, and that's not on the interpreter. So if we allow everyone who can just pass a knowledge and ethics exam and say, okay, good enough, c'est la vie, then there's no teeth to the law. And I think I'm fed up with seeing that. I think the argument is it's always gone back and forth, and it's a war that's currently in the trenches.
So my understanding is the EIPA written in the 3.7 is for those who don't want or for whatever reason have no interest in becoming nationally certified. That's why that option exists. That being said, people who take the CASLI have an ultimate goal of becoming nationally certified interpreters. So if you could help me understand why we don't want folks with a CASLI working in the educational system if they've already proven that they have the skill set, at least a minimum skill set, at least some receptive skills based on passing the written test. Help me understand that. For example, somebody who's taken the EIPA of a 3.7 and the written exam has already proven that they have some level of production competency. They might not be a top tier interpreter, but they can interpret to a degree.
This is Vice Chair Perdue. Yes. So again, could be a person that has only watched a few videos, taken a few courses, and they've never learned how to interpret. This person could then go take the CASLI written exam. They could have no ability when it comes to a receptive or productive performance test to pass that test. Now, with EIP 3.7, it is low, and we do want it to be higher. Even the community has said 3.7 is too high for some of the interpreters that are out there currently working. The interpreting community has said that many of those interpreters currently within the education site don't have that. They have not attained that, and that's a concern. But again, that's a minimum EIPA performance. The test itself is looking at the interpreting skills, both in working into English and into ASL, whereas the Kathleen Knowledge and Ethics test does not look at that at all. There's no assessment of interpreting skills whatsoever, not one iota. It is only receptive of questions. So understanding what is being presented. So as an example, if you're working for an agency and you get a request for interpreting services for 3 hours for a conference, how many interpreters should you send? That's a sample question. I think at least one to, like one third of the interpreter or people could understand that, right? They would be able to understand. Does that mean that they would know how to interpret if they know to send 1 to 3 interpreters? So we're talking about the capability to understand a question, and or do they truly have the ability to have the interpreting skills required to interpret, not merely understand?
If I may. So I understand that perspective. That being said, my feeling is it's the school system's responsibility to make sure that these individuals are competent in their production. They should have some type of screening in place before they bring these interpreters on board. Now, I completely understand your point, but particularly with licensure now, I think the school systems, because of licensure, will have a little bit more due diligence to make sure that they're bringing on board appropriate interpreters that are well matched to that student. And I know that there are many interpreters who have passed the CASLI written exam and who also are competent in their production. So saying everyone who passes the CASLI written exam has blanketly saying has no signing skills is not fair. I'm not
And
saying
I'm
that
not.
they don't.
Oh,
I've got it.
go.
I'm just saying that
Yeah.
they possibly, potentially could. We could possibly have somebody who takes that test and passes it, but regardless, there is no assessment of their interpreting skills. So who's to say one way or another? And yes, absolutely, the school systems should screen, but do they actually do that? You know, what are the current requirements right now? I know the counties close to where I live allow a 2.25 and a 2.75 to work with children. Okay. Now, so a CASLI interpreter could pass that. Okay. But could they even get that score after passing the CASLI piece? So, where do we toe the line? What holds more weight?
So I'm wondering, Mr. Leffler again. I know we have no authority over school districts and the systems they're in. We don't have that, but we could send a letter, sort of an opening letter to the
MSD.
group MSD, and again, encouraging them to educate and encourage school systems to screen their interpreters, right? Do you think that would be helpful if we bring it to their attention of that need?
If I remember, one open comment from one individual spoke to pay for educational K-12 interpreters and how typically is low. And I have seen that and I agree. I think there are two camps of people, those who really, really enjoy interpreting in a K-12 setting or an educational setting, generally speaking, to whom that really speaks to them and they want that experience and they like that type of work. And then there's that camp of individuals who for whom it's the only place where they can work because the requirements are so low and the pay is low, meaning that if they were actually a competent qualified interpreter, they wouldn't accept that level of pay, $15 to $20 an hour, when they could go out and get marginally more, like $50 an hour. Which would you take? And I am not saying this blanket about all educational interpreters. I'm saying that typically speaking, those who are available in those settings are the least qualified. So I second your idea of sending a letter, but we can certainly recommend, that school systems do X, Y, and Z. But if they don't change the pay, they're not going to incentivize qualified interpreters to apply in those settings. Again, I'm not making a blanket statement, but typically you're going to get those lower qualifications, lower skill set. And it all goes back to our students, not availability. We have to think about the deaf and hard of hearing children.
And I do agree that the children are the mission we are serving to support now. But in 2025, there are no requirements for educational interpreters. Nothing. We don't have that in Maryland. I mean, whether a person is rudimentary at best or highly proficient, we have no requirements. So with these regulations, we could put in 3.7 EIPA requirement. We could also have another requirement that we could put in that requires more accountability, right? To require those competent individuals. More accountability on the interpreters themselves to have that onus of accountability. So if we add the EIPA to the Castly side of things, I'm open to that. Mm. I'm trying to process all of this and, like where we can go, which is best for both the school systems and the children, and then also for interpreters, because my understanding is that there are several interpreters who have already taken the CASLE exam. They are getting ready and they're also motivated and looking to work within the educational system, and they're looking for certification.
This is Leslie. What if, okay, if we're really talking about, and I'm collecting my thoughts, and again, not necessarily availability, but what if when it comes to oversight and protection of access, quality access to education, what if we say provisional can't work in a legal setting? They can interpret in education, medical, and mental health with a fully licensed interpreter working alongside them. Thoughts?
Hmm. Okay, so with that framework. But again, also thinking about Southern Maryland, Eastern Shore. They don't have many fully certified interpreters or fully licensed interpreters. Like Sue was just explaining on Eastern Shore, they have five certified interpreters, meaning that we'd have to assume that those five would also then be licensed. And now with the provisionally licensed interpreters, we're in a school system, we'd have to then figure out how to get those individuals into the school system, which means we're then taking five interpreters from the community setting. So again, these K-12 systems don't have any certified fully licensed interpreters. And if we put all of them there, then we're robbing Peter to pay Paul in the sense of pulling them from the courts and community medical offices. So I get that we're looking to craft language that protects our children, to have licensed interpreters within all of these settings. But how are these interpreters and why would they pick the educational setting over these other opportunities that they have? So again, I'm thinking specifically of Eastern Shore, Western Maryland, Southern Maryland. I'm struggling with just the fact that we don't have a contingent of interpreters ready and available in those settings. And I do not want the children to suffer at all. I don't want the children sitting there all day having no idea what's going on. I mean, imagine Eastern Shore having only five licensed interpreters and Maryland having only a few and Western Maryland, again, I think the point is the school systems, They have children with no interpreters year round. That is not fair at all if this were to go forward. We have to commit to having qualified interpreters within both worlds of where interpreters end up, whether that's the educational system or the community settings. And I'm struggling with, again, the idea of a child having no access to any interpreter whatsoever if we make it too restrictive. Vice Chair Puzio.
This is Leslie speaking. I understand. Also, historically, we've heard from those who've experienced this, deaf children, whether they prefer an interpreter, qualified or not qualified, in comparison to a qualified interpreter. And I've talked to parents, we've heard from parents, from the town halls and from the emails, and all the parents have spoken to their child's access and service. And they have all said, all the parents unanimously have said that they want at least a 4.0.
Right.
So if we allow the CASLI, you know, no parent of a deaf child has said, I would accept a knowledge and ethical exam as a minimum standard to work with my child. They want to see proof of interpretation skill, and they voice that feeling with wanting a 4.0. And I don't see how that happens with an ethical exam. I mean, we can go round and around and around about this, and it's still something that warrants discussion, but we're between a rock and a hard place. And my sense is that, I represent interpreters on the board, but my primary reason for being here is to make the deaf community, I mean, I know not all, it's not just me only. I mean, I support interpreter growth. I support interpreter development. I support growing the field, but growing the field with qualified, competent interpreting services being provided. And the priority of making sure those people receive services and that they're quality services. I know it's they're stepping stones in terms of scaffolding up the requirements and the rigor. And I feel if, we've already acquiesced with the 3.7, to be completely honest, but at least that shows some level of proof, especially if we have some other type of oversight for those individuals who haven't arrived at that level with their interpreting skills. How do we know that we're doing anything different than what has historically happened and what's currently taking place?
If you don't mind a question of proof of competency, I'm trying to understand with the CASLI, the or general provision licensed interpreter, they can work within any community setting, right? They can interpret it in at a university setting, at a college, at community events, all these various and sundry places that an interpreter would be, and they don't have to have competency proven and validated prior to going, correct? But with educational interpreting, you feel so strongly about having that validated competency. Do you mind explaining that a little bit?
So if you go to a community event, you have a greater ability to file a grievance or to tell the interpreter that they're not a qualified interpreter. You have some autonomy to call out their skills. Okay, do most children, are they going to be able to voice that same concern during their educational day? Some might be comfortable doing that. Okay, but then what ultimately happens? They can't get rid of their interpreter.
Right. Students are able to file complaints, or they can ask their parents to file complaints as well. That's a possibility.
Yes, but right now,
Parents
how
have the
often
power.
does that actually happen?
Parents have the power. It's our job to educate the parents on what is their rights, what are the rights of their deaf students, their children. And again, we need to do the outreach, and we haven't done that outreach with a lot of the parents. We need to do more of that. It's been insufficient, and educating parents, that letting them know that their students have the right to file a complaint for X, Y, Z, and everything in between. But again, I agree. There are some students who would feel comfortable telling their parents, "My interpreter's lousy. There's no oversight." Right now, where they don't have a process of oversight. We're looking at creating that process with licensure now. So if an interpreter has seven different violations where essentially we are then being involved with it. I mean, again, parents have the ability to file a complaint already with the school system. They can file those complaints as is. So teachers can file, principals can file, and anybody can file a complaint if an interpreter is not good. An assistant in the classroom can, a parent, paraprofessional, etc. So those are routes that exist.
All right, well, then let me pose this question. A kindergartner or a first or second grader, how do they know what they're missing? Okay, when it comes to instruction in the classroom. Okay, somebody's up there signing and they assume that they're getting all the information. They assume that everything is being interpreted that the teacher's saying. Okay, my feeling is about that is that parents, let it become the parents' responsibility. Okay, you're asking the school system for validation and proof of skill. That could be the parents going in and doing an observation themselves. And grades are also going to tell the story. Students' behavior is going to tell the story, whether or not the interpreter is or is not qualified. That will indicate whether they are not qualified. But when we're talking about those lower elementary grades, it's the parents' responsibility ultimately to provide oversight. The board can't oversee every single interpreter. Our responsibility and our charge is licensure, not oversight or validating an individual interpreter's competency. We're here just to develop the regs for the licensure itself. Yes, we care about the kids. Trust me, I've worked in educational interpreting for over 16 years, and I have watched and seen many, many instances, things that were ultimately very heartbreaking. And my students saying, I had no interpreter yesterday for an entire day, not having access to their education. We need to create a license and we need to make it accessible for the community and for those deaf children. And we also need to support our interpreting community in being able to develop their craft. That's my opinion. I think we're in an impasse because I feel like we're going around in circles.
So EIPA 3.7, I believe that is. CASLI has the 5-year restraint on it. So are we looking for a general license? Do we want to put maybe at a 4.0 if they have CASLI, provisional general license? I mean that's our goal anyway, right? So if somebody with the national or regional certification is I think we are at an impasse, and it's also 8:50, and we're supposed to adjourn soon. I don't think we are able to make a decision at this point. I think we need to hold discussion for another meeting to where we can have a more substantive discussion on that. Are there thoughts?
My only concern with tabling this for later is that these need to be published for the open comment period again, because statute requires a second 30-day reading or review for open comment, which now extends our timeline even further.
Right. And yes, they need to be finalized. They haven't been. So do we want to table this discussion for one more week and have discussion next week? What would the board like to do on this issue?
I don't know what will happen if we're, for example, in a tie with the four of us here.
So I think we would have to have somebody motion for a tiebreaker
No,
that
no,
I
no, no,
would.
no. Just to clarify, if we delay until, to your point, next week, and then we have all four of us back again to vote, suppose we end up in a tie at that point, what happens? because we have a board of four.
So that's when we'd want to ask legal counsel for advice on that.
Okay, so all right, so then
So yes, we can table this discussion, do some more homework, analysis, collect data on it, and bring that to the next meeting next week. Uh, I do want to remind us all that we should not be in a rush, and we are not. We want to get this right. And what I would like and hopefully see is a second round where the public comments are available for the community to make, and people show with their comments that they have trust and they are comfortable with the board that with our decision. I would like the community to get together where we could also see that again conformity of decision and having the community members having the ability to ask community members what they think, and going through sort of like these sort of feedback sessions on this. And we can make a decision together as a community. And I think that would be the best approach.
so this is Leslie. I would say for those joining us right now, if you are the parent of a deaf child in the school system, please reach out and email us and let us know your point of view. In addition, you can reach out to MSD. We should reach out to them and ask their teachers or their staff who, not no sign, I misspoke, but who are directly involved in the instruction and the learning of deaf children and
Mhm.
accessibility. They might, since they are doing it in real time, that would be a group to collect feedback from as well.
Yes, and I can reach out to them and we can get their feedback and I can then share with the board. We can ask for their feedback by, do you want to say next week on Friday? And then we would then meet in 2 weeks.
I won't be available the 8th through the 18th, but you can certainly proceed without me or before. Yeah, I won't be available the 7th to the 12th. Yeah, so we'll have to look at our
Oh,
calendars.
all right, so we can discuss more later on when we want to meet again, when it aligns with all of our schedules. So we want to then essentially look at that after we have a deadline for feedback, et cetera.
Okay. DSD's calendar, their biweekly calendar as well.
Oh, yes. I think it's important for our regulations and, to have enough legal clarity on the specific issues, to have this feedback so that we are proceeding correctly in this endeavor. So I think we want to table the discussion and we'll continue it at the next board meeting. And we'll announce to the community when that is later. I think this has been a very fulsome and beneficial discussion for all of us. And again, educational interpreting is always a sensitive issue. We know that. We know what the stakes are. So I want to say, we are looking at supporting the community of our deaf children, the school systems, the interpreters, everyone writ large. So we do want to get the community as a whole's feedback and also specific groups therein. I hope everyone has a wonderful evening, and we are adjourning at 8:54.